Okay, we're good to go. We'll call the meeting to order. We do have a quorum in a number of different dimensions, but we do have a quorum. Declaration of pecuniary interests. If there are none, we'll carry on. Ask for approval of the agenda. Andy, seconded by Pat. All in favor? Perfect. Yeah, we'll be able to get proper motions. So we're going to welcome back our representatives from VG Architects and MCG Consulting. Welcome back, John and Chris. We'll try this again. We'll get right underway with your presentation.
Thank you very much.
You can go ahead and start.
Okay, yeah, the last time around was obviously some technical difficulties on my end that I think have been resolved now, and this should go much more smoothly. Thank you for your time, everyone. I'm just going to go through the agenda briefly. We'll go through introductions of myself and John. Part two, we'll look at the building condition assessment scope that we completed. Part three is the police service staffing study that was basically completed by John and Richard over the last months of last year, and then the facility space analysis that our firm completed based on the results of Matrix's work. Next slide. Next slide. So the core team was myself, Chris Hall from Plus VG Architects. I was the project manager and architectural consultant for the project. Richard Brady and John Scruggs from Matrix Consulting Group completed the extensive work in terms of consultation with the group and data analysis for the service strategy that we'll be presenting today. Next slide. So there were basically two concurrent streams of focus. One was the service delivery and operational needs of Kawartha Lakes Police Service, and facility assessment and physical space needs. So the service delivery aspect was dealt with by John and Richard. The facility assessment by our firm. Early stages of the project included collecting information from the team at the police service, as well as Kawartha Lakes. We completed an assessment of the current and forecasted needs of the police services, and then looked at implementation strategies, which we'll go into in the last section of this. As mentioned, I completed the role of overseeing and project managing the project, whereas Richard and John led the service delivery and operational needs stream. So we'll go into the first part, which is the building condition assessment. Next slide. As you know, the building that you're in is about 25 to 27 years old now. It was first constructed for the Lindsay Police Service, which became the Kawartha Lakes Police Service through amalgamation. The facility remained in operation throughout since 1995. It's a one-story building, approximately 19,500 square feet of gross floor area, and it's been the home of the police services in the city since '95, as mentioned. Our team for the assessment of the facility comprised ourselves, Plus VG Architects, to look at the building envelope, exterior grounds, interior finishes, millwork, etc. Van der West and Rutherford were our mechanical and electrical engineers, looking at the various M&E systems, as well as the fire and life safety systems. And Tacoma Engineering provided structural system assessment. Just high level, we would comment that the building and its principal components are generally in fair to good condition. There were no major surprises in terms of the condition of the building given its age, but there definitely are some deficiencies and deferred maintenance aspects that need to be addressed. Next slide. This is a list of some of the more urgent deficiencies that need to be addressed in the near term. We basically comprised two costing tables that will go into some detail on how these and when these things should occur. Next slide. There are some things that need to be done probably fairly immediately in terms of establishing an ongoing program of building maintenance and repairs for various systems in the building. We have been in consultation with the city project manager and facilities regarding how that would happen, and they've increased their level of attention on some of the urgent areas of the building in the meantime to prevent any kind of continued deterioration. There should be a hazardous material survey conducted for the building, just so that you have record of where you have hazardous materials on the site and how to manage them in the future. We would recommend an assessment of the existing storm and sanitary sub-drainage systems, just to confirm there's no deficiencies in that part of the system, because it's impossible to tell from our visual assessment work. There should also be a barrier-free accessibility audit completed at some point in the near future. So I'm just going to give you some high-level numbers here in terms of the architectural and structural components of the building. We've identified over a 15-year timeline about $1.7 million worth of basically deferred maintenance work, replacement of various components of the building in terms of roofing, caulking, sealant systems, some flooring and interior finishes. And we've broken that into kind of two timelines. One, within the next year, we would recommend about $900,000 of that be completed work to avoid any ongoing deterioration of those systems. And a subsequent, over the next 5 years, another $820,000 worth of repairs and corrective measures. On the mechanical electrical side, we have also broken down the activities that need to be completed, various systems in the building, about $1.1 million worth of mechanical electrical improvements need to be carried out. And obviously how they're implemented and timing needs to be discussed in further detail with Kawartha Lakes and funding allocations and that type of thing. But we have broken it down by its level of urgency, which you can see in this table. So just in summary, we're recommending that within 1 year of the completion of this assessment that about $1.4 million worth of repairs and deferred maintenance activities should be carried out at the building. Within the next 5 years, another 1.14 million. And then obviously it drops off quite dramatically after that, because you've got basically a new life cycle for a lot of the systems in the building once you complete that work. So some nominal costs going forward for the 10 and 15-year windows. So that's basically the health of your building. I'll pass it on to John now to discuss the police service staffing study that he completed and the findings of that.
Got it. Thank you very much. Again, my name is John Scruggs. I'm with MCG Consulting. Rich cannot make it today. Both times he's ended up on a plane the day we've had this projected to present. So I will take over from there. I'll go over the staffing assessment, next slide, and we'll go from there. So so we were retained to really get a understanding of the police service operations in the current state, and then develop projections from the current state and service delivery going forward. So what your future needs are going to be. So to do that, we develop an understanding key workload indicators So we go in and we do a lot of interviews, talk to a bunch of folks who, in different parts of the organization, understand exactly what they do. And then with that, we develop the assessment of the, what our key workload performance measure would be, and assessment of the current and future staffing based on that. And then we convert those metrics to projected staffing. We use a couple of different methods to do that overall. One is population of workloads, another is spans of control, and then unique factors. There are some jobs that, it's neither a span of control or population based, it's a need that you have to fulfill. And then we looked at how those services may change with growth, and did an evaluation of alternative service delivery issues and opportunities. Next slide. So scope and approach, like I said, we obtain input from Kawartha Lakes Police Service Board staff, as well as the local detachment of the Ontario Provincial Police. We asked for a lot of data. So we got calls for service delivery data. We end up getting detective caseloads. And then we looked at, the service delivery model that is currently in use there. And then, as I stated earlier, we projected staffing levels to meet future needs, knowing what your growth may be. We're trying to project out and how many folks you need to accomplish the goals of the police service. Next slide. So the biggest finding here, and this, I'll explain the slide here. So what we look at is how many officers you have on the street, or constables you have on the street at any one time, and then how many calls are coming in, calls for service. And then we look at those calls and see how long they take. We aggregate the data from the entire year and come up with an estimate that your average call takes this long. And so what you're looking at in this chart is, basically from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m., there are not a lot of calls coming in, and therefore there's not a lot of, police resources needed. So you have what we call a proactive level of 84%, which is really very high. However, in a smaller police service, you have to have enough staff on to take care of, emergency calls like, serious car wrecks, domestic assaults, those kind of calls. So you're normally going to see that overnight in a smaller police service. And then as you go through the day, you'll see from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., you're actually below what we would consider a good threshold for overall proactivity. When you start to see the green go to gray shading, it means that you're having less proactive time. So your constables can't do as much follow-up. They can't do any proactive, traffic stops or pedestrian checks. They can't, work with a homeowner or a business owner because they're starting to go call to call to call. And really, once it's under, 20% is where it's more critical. And as you can see from this graph, on Fridays, you're particularly below staffing what we'd recommend. From 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. and 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., the constables there are basically going from call to call to call on those particular days. And that's an average throughout the year. But as you look at the final overall, you'll see that overall you have 40 or 57% proactivity level, and we're recommending right around 60% for a police service your size. And that's again based on factors of overnight staffing that's required, and then the anticipated call load you'd have during the day. And then, and based on that, we're saying that your current staffing is just about appropriate, even though you have some gray shaded boxes on Fridays, you're going to be busy then. However, going forward, we will be projecting additional staffing, and we're assuming that you'd start that process sooner than later. Next slide. Okay. So, some of the functions do have current or short-term staffing needs. One of the things that happened that you're aware of is that CECC case responsibility was shifted from the province to the municipality. And so that greatly impacts staffing. And I found a typo on this last minute. So you have one detective assigned to work all those cases, but really the workload is equivalent to about 5 detectives. with the number of incidents that occur within the CECC. And so you're going to need 3 additional detectives for a total of 5 to handle that caseload alone. And then you also have a need for 2 additional dispatchers. Currently, they're meeting normal dispatch timelines. However, they also handle administrative calls, so they're extra busy during the daytime hours, and of course, administrative calls even after hours that they receive. And then there's going to be a change to the constables needed, the special constables needed working in court security as you increase the security features of the courthouse. So all our police functions are adequately staffed to meet workloads and service needs. One thing we did want to call out is you have an administrative sergeant doing homeless outreach and working with folks who are drug affected. That is a really good program that you have there. That will help reduce calls for service later on and gets people the services they need now. Next slide, please. So projecting staffing, like I mentioned earlier, we use a couple of different ways to do that. One is workload-based methods. So a lot of workloads are tracked, like calls for service, detective caseloads, but sometimes they're not. And so in those particular cases, we use a fixed coverage method or a non-scaling method. And then we also use ratio-based. So if you have 19 constables, you need more than 1 supervisor. So we use a ratio like around 1 to 8, 1 supervisor to 8 direct reports. And that's a standard that's pretty international for police services. Next slide. So this kind of goes through how we make that determination. We do interviews and data collection. We identify potential workload drivers. Not everything is categorized. So if you have somebody who's working in a secretary type position, they're not going to write down how many emails they receive a day or send a day or phone calls. So you can't count all that, but you still need that position even if you don't have a workload driver behind that. And then we also look at is the workload scalable. So do we know there's a direct proportion of how much work will be done there based on either population or projected workload increase? And so this particular slide just kind of shows you how our determination is made, but the most important thing to get out of this is we use either fixed coverage, ratio-based, non-scaling, or as a proportion of the workload for supervision. Next slide. And so we looked at the population projection increases over the next 20 years using provincial data that was presented to us. And we focused on Lindsay and Ops. So overall, Kawartha Lakes is projected to grow about 21% in the next 20 years. What's important to know when we're doing these projections is not every new household means another call for service. So even with the population you have now, only a certain percentage of your population calls. And so we look at existing calls for service, and then as the population grows from there. And so we can, from this, we can also deduct, though, we look at current, how many calls for service there are, and how many of those actually turn out to be a assigned caseload to a detective. Because then again, if you go to a disturbance call, that may end up getting assigned to a detective. But if you go to a noise call and it's handled by the constable on scene, it's not a caseload. It's not going to end up in a caseload. So we actually look at the scalability of how many calls for service you have currently, and then the impact downstream, how many of those will turn into detective cases, and then we project that forward. Next slide. So with that, we looked at total workload hours based on the calls for service, and as you can see in a projected staffing needs for patrol, we're saying by 2025 you need to add 4 additional constables, by 2030 6, by 2035 7, and by 2040 8. And I would say, based on that graph I already showed you where you had some gray shading areas on Friday, the 4 you'd want to start working on hiring those in the immediate future to meet that staffing need on Fridays. And with that, I think we're taking questions at the end. So that is the end of part 3 of this presentation.
Thanks very much, John. So out of the findings from John's work, we took that information and did an analysis of your existing facility and what you should typically expect to need in terms of space for the type of staffing levels that is expected out of John's recommendations. Our initial observation is the building, while it's 25 years old, is generally consistently organized around contemporary police facility organization. There's a clear delineation of public access areas and separation from the other functional areas of the building. Obviously, the police garage and restricted zones are situated at the back of the building with clear dedicated access. So in terms of the general, I guess, the bones of the building, you've got a good building, well organized and meets the needs of a contemporary police service. Next slide. We did a bit of a sort of planning analysis of the facility. We organized it around various zones. So basically the green zone is your public areas of the building. The blue zones are your operational areas. The orange zones are your restricted access areas, so secure containment areas, sally port, cells, that type of thing. And then the gray areas are your garage components. So with this kind of understanding of how the building is organized, we were able to do an analysis of the space utilization. This is a bit dry maybe for some of you, but just in terms of the definitions that we use in terms of assigning the space analysis, we have FTE is the term for a full-time equivalent personnel. So you'll see that in the tables. It means the number of full-time employees basically in that role. Footprint allocation is the area needed for that particular person on the site. Assignable area is basically taking that footprint and factoring it up for the things that you need to get to your space. So we use factors of 1.2 and 1.3 depending on the type of space. So you'll see that in the tables as well. Basically generates a gross building area target for the building with other gross up factors for mechanical, electrical spaces and the kind of spaces that we don't list in terms of areas. So this is the general kind of strategy in terms of how the space analysis works. In terms of the workspace standards, we establish private office space allocations based on our experience with similar facilities. We have a 20 square meter office, a 13 square meter office, and an 11 square meter office, depending on the activity of the role. And in open area workstations, so these would be spaces that aren't private offices, but a touchdown area for constables or staff. We have a 5 square meter allocation or a 4 square meter allocation, depending on the type of space and needs of that user. Next slide. Oh, sorry. You were already on the next slide. Just in terms of the supporting activities that aren't just sort of driven by individuals, but are driven by activities, storage, obviously the reception area, a public interface area, police garage spaces and storage facilities, the restricted area, cells, sally port, etc. So these are all, we assigned areas to these based on our experience with similar scale facilities. So I'll go through this fairly quickly. It's something that anyone who wants to look at it in more detail is free to do, but we've got a number of slides here that just go through the various components of the building. We've tried to color code them to tie in with the plan that we showed at the start, but your public access areas include your vestibule, public reception area, barrier-free washrooms, victim services, interview rooms, community meeting space. So we basically assigned areas for these and come up with a target area. You'll see in the assignable area column, second from the right. That's the target we would identify you need for that use in the building. And then the existing area is basically what you actually are using for that purpose right now. So those two last columns are the ones that are pertinent to our findings. You could probably just sort of scroll through these, but you can see the support service spaces are basically the engine room of the building. And you can see you're under assigned in that area. Information services, next slide, sorry. Information services, you're hitting about the right target for the needs of that component. Shared spaces, you're definitely under in terms of the amenities for the staff, locker areas, lunchrooms. As Tom and Mark know, the fitness room has been co-opted from a former use and is not ideal. So there's a number of spaces in the building that are under provided, and those were our findings. The restricted and secure function area is also smaller than it should be in terms of the space allocations that we would expect to see for your program. And the police garage is also undersized. So the basic findings are, if down at the bottom of this table, at the bottom of this table, we have a total target GFA for this building for your facility needs of about just under 21,000 square feet. Your existing building is about 19,600. So it's less than a 10% delta between them, which we wouldn't suggest is a dramatic undersized facility. So next slide summarizes some of these findings. In the preceding space analysis table, we noted the optimal size for your building, and your existing facility is slightly under that. What we would say is that the existing space allocations are based upon analysis of the original building drawings and reviewed by police services senior staff. So there may be some inaccuracies, and we can confirm those as planning gets more detailed, but we have a general sense of how the building's used and where you're deficient. There is a current plan for a new forensic identification and property storage area in the building. We're actually involved in the design of that right now, so we're fairly up to speed on what is planned, and that is actually reflected in our space analysis, that space has actually happened. So that's factored into the analysis. Next slide. So just at a high level, we kind of summarize the various departments or areas of the building and whether they were oversized or undersized. Our observation is the public access areas are slightly larger than they need to be. The office of the chief, which comprises not just his office, but also associated waiting areas, conference room, executive assistant space, various components. That area is oversized in terms of what we would expect to see for that space allocation. And similarly, the information services is slightly larger than it needs to be. The big deficiencies are in the operation, support services, and shared spaces. There's about 2,800 square feet of deficiency in that area, as well as the restricted and secure function areas, about 800 square feet in deficiency. And the police garage is smaller than we would expect to see for a facility of your scale. So our high-level conclusions are that while we don't think there's an addition required to the building, we would recommend there be consideration for renovations of about 4,000 to 5,000 square feet of the building to better allocate space for operations. As part of those renovations, where you're moving spaces around, you're able to upgrade them as well to contemporary levels for lighting and HVAC and plumbing fixtures and that type of thing. So that basically was the space planning component, and we obviously talked about the building condition assessment component at the start of the presentation. So the scenario planning analysis that we've completed is basically looking at how do we allocate funds over time for the building, and they're driven by the two aspects: one, the condition of the building, and two, the service levels required in the building and the facilities that are required. So if we're using a 5,000 square foot target of renovated interior renovations, basically in the building, and a blended unit rate of $350 a square feet for the renovations, the costs are higher because of the type of facility we're dealing with here than you might find in an office space, for example. But we've identified a suggested allocation of about $1.75 million be allocated for renovating the building just to meet your space needs. And this allocation is obviously got to be done over a 20-year period, so there'll be more detailed discussions, and this document can be updated as decisions are made as to when that happens. Next slide. So for the purposes of our scenario planning analysis, over the next 5 years, we're recommending allocating about $3.2 million to renovations to the building. That includes deferred maintenance aspects that were identified in the building condition assessment, as well as a portion of that renovation. The first 5 years, we've got the property storage area renovation cost in here. Next slide is the 10-year planning horizon, which includes the building condition assessment recommendations of about $230,000 within the next 10 years, and then about just over $1 million in renovations, assuming half of the renovation scope would be completed in that 10-year period. So about 1.3 million in the next 10 years. Next slide. On the 20-year planning horizon, we're looking at about another 1.4 million. These are escalated numbers too. So the longer you wait to do work, the more it costs. Obviously, the cost of business goes up as time goes on, as we all know. So we have escalated those numbers and given you kind of an accurate reflection of the allocation in that 20-year planning period. And with that, that kind of summarizes our findings to date, and we'll open it up to any questions you have for myself or John.
Thank you, gentlemen. Terrific report, extremely comprehensive. I've been involved in policing for about 40 years, and when it comes to the staffing model, I've never seen one quite that in-depth, and enjoyed reading that. No slight on Chris, but buildings don't interest me quite as much as the staffing model, but very good. So we'll open it up to questions. Do we have any questions in regards to the presentation? Andy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of questions. I agree, great presentation. Thank you. Interesting, because we're, as a council, as a city, we're also hearing presentations from, the growth of our fire department in the Lindsay area, strategic plan, our paramedics, and how they need to grow. And it's interesting to sort of put them all together and say, should we be looking at some facility that accommodates all of our services from a cost, emergency services factor, and just do it sort of once, do it right, and sort of accommodate everybody. So interesting. One of the questions I have, when you factor in the growth, population growth, and the needs for more, more constables or more detectives, staffing, I guess, you base it on the provincial growth numbers. I understand that. Numbers that, by the way, we've never met here in Kawartha Lakes, but that's another story. But when you factor in the growth, one of the things that came forward that was interesting from our ambulance strategic plan was is there any correlation to our aging population? And I know, obviously with ambulances, older folks in our community will need ambulances more often than younger folks, and the need as our population grows, it's not just based on the growth number, but it's that growth number increases as does the need. I don't know if I'm explaining it right, but as does the need for more ambulances, because as our population gets older, they're calling the ambulance more often. And I wonder, is that a factor with policing? Is there any data out there that suggests that an aging, an older population does not need police as often as a younger population, or are we just strictly basing this on strictly on growth? Based on a growth factor of by like you said, by 2030 or 2040, the projection is this many people. But is there any factor in there about, aging or younger populations, or is there any tie into how your staffing would change as a result of that? I don't even know if that makes sense, but I'm putting it out there.
It totally makes sense. So, we look at historical past growth patterns in other cities as we develop this. So here's the issue. You're correct. Older folks call police less often. They're also less likely to be involved in crime. However, so as you have an older aging population, any new projected growth is going to be new housing, which will come with younger folks. So it kind of offsets each other. We do find in other staffing analysis we've done in other high growth areas that new housing tends to call in a little less. And then as it starts the population starts to age, we start to see more calls. So in factoring for Kawartha Lakes, we looked at what your current population is, the anticipated growth, knowing that a mix of those two is going to still give us about the same ratio of calls for service that you currently have from the population. Does that make sense? So it is a mix.
That does make sense. Thank you. Yeah. Follow up if I can. So no, that's great. Thank you. I was just curious because I'm really I'm interested in that. How does that tie into all our emergency services and our needs as an entire community for not just police but fire, ambulance? So it's interesting when you sort of put the three plans together and sort of see what they have in common and where they don't have in common. So thank you. Regarding the building assessment, when you talked about the first few slides, the 1.5 million over 10 years, or I think, or 20 years. Part of the work we've approved this year's budget, a couple of $100,000, and I know there's a work for a couple of $100,000 being projected for next year. Is that part of that, or is that something totally separate, that a different need? Or does that sort of factor into that and maybe that's more of a question for Mark than you guys, but.
So just to clarify,
it would be difficult for me to comment.
So just to clarify, Chris, that's the what's been allocated is for the property room renovation that you spoke to earlier.
Right. So then no, that money is not going to address some of the kind of existing condition issues, the deferred maintenance considerations that are identified in the building condition assessment. It would capture some of the dollar projections in our scenario planning there, because it would pick up that renovation, but the dollars we're suggesting need to be invested in the building are above and beyond that 400, I think.
Okay, thank you. One more if I can, real quick. So, and at the end there, you were talking about some of the portions of the existing building that are undersized, undersized from a space perspective. And we won't talk about the oversized chief's office, but we'll just talk about what's undersized for now. But I'm just wondering, as those undersized areas since it was built in 1995, have we grown the police force in the use of staffing to the point that they're now undersized, or was the building not designed as it probably should have been back in 1995? Have we grown into that, or are we really just, there are areas that have been undersized right from the start for what should have been?
I think it's probably a product of growth. I don't know whether John did any historic assessment of staffing levels at Kawartha Lakes, but something tells me the building is accommodating more people now than it did when it was first built. And some of the assignments of spaces seem like they maybe were always a little less than ideal in terms of efficiency of space, but I would suggest the bulk of it is from growth of some of the space allocations that are needed for the support component of the building, more than the public areas that are quite generous in comparison to what we would expect to see in a typical police facility of this size.
Okay, thank you.
I don't have the historic perspective of staffing prior to 3 years ago, so I think Tom could probably answer that best.
I think maybe the chair could answer that one, only from the standpoint of also being the deputy chief and being on the building committee when that building was first brought in, and it wasn't terribly long after the building opened that we increased our staff, including Inspector Hickey, by 6 officers in one shot when we took in the ops area around. So, yeah, we've increased growth in the police personnel side. Before I just ask if there's any more questions, did you consider the parking aspect in that growth? I think we're underutilized, in the staffing or in the parking area now, and with a projected increase in staff, was there any consideration given to that?
To be honest, Tom, there wasn't. We didn't do a lot of analysis of the larger site, and perhaps we can look at that for you. I know that the facility is part of a kind of compound of municipal buildings, so a sort of broader, as was raised by the chair, in terms of a broader kind of look of the facilities in the area might be worthwhile, and whether the other emergency service strategic plans dovetail with yours, that's definitely an opportunity for some economies as well. So we didn't look specifically at the parking counts, I must admit.
Thank you. We'll work on the mayor to get maybe an indoor garage with parking on top of it there, and that'll cover a couple of issues. We could use the chief's office, exactly. The only other comment or note that I'd made is you made reference to a hazardous material evaluation, and you referenced an Ontario regulation. Is that something that's required by law?
It's required by law of a building owner to provide that to anyone doing work in their building. So if you're renovating the building, you'll need to have a document like that tells the contractor whether there's asbestos insulation on piping or anything that they would need to be aware of as a hazard in the building. So it's not something you have to do like tomorrow, but it's something you should have a record of the hazardous materials in your building, and that is a regulation, a responsibility of building owners.
Well, it looks like we've got some renovations coming up, and it certainly is on a priority list. And any other questions? Pat?
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. Andy touched on a number of the subjects that, from a city perspective that we're looking at. You used the phrase underprovided. I just really haven't always seen that used very often. Is that just the space allocated that you think could have been better used? Is that what you mean by underprovided?
Yeah, well, I think the building needs a fresh look in terms of some of the space layouts and how space is allocated. under provided is that, you've got, you would typically see a fitness room for the police service that is properly sized to accommodate the equipment you would expect to see in there. And I know at your facility, it's basically, one space that they could find to put in a rowing machine or a rack of weights, and that's basically what you're making do with. So it's that kind of thing. It's people doing what they can to accommodate the needs in the space that that they have available. It's not the ideal way to organize and design a building. So it needs a kind of bigger global look of how you could reorganize the building a bit.
Follow up?
Just to follow up, thanks, Mr. Chair. I noticed when you talked about the scenario for the next 5 years for renovations and potential, probably not the scope of your survey or your, but was it part of the plan to touch on how we would carry on services within the 5 years on a major renovation? Or it may not have been part of scope, it may not have been the scope of your work. I don't know.
I mean, there are a variety of strategies, obviously, for how you renovate in an occupied facility. We've got a lot of experience with that, whether it be temporary trailer accommodations or an analysis of what spaces could be worked on after hours. There are different strategies, but because there's no kind of design yet, we aren't really able to comment on the best strategy for the building. Understanding that you need the building to remain operational throughout any work.
Maybe you're going to ask, Mr. Chair. I didn't wonder if the police, yourself or the staff office, the officers are here, if they'd have any comments on the staffing or something they saw around that.
I will, as soon as I just check with the other board members if there are any other questions, Valmay or Wanda.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Through you. I did wonder whether or not the study, since it was undertaken during COVID, had or applied a filter of accommodation for unique circumstances like that that may impact utilization of space or cause us to think differently about space utilization.
I could say that there wasn't a real focus on a kind of work from home option or anything like that. Obviously, the way that society in general is reacting to the past year and different strategies that are being implemented, like this meeting, for example, and how we're all doing these things differently. There wasn't a consideration of a kind of COVID space utilization and what that means. It was really about physical people in the building, and whether that is something that will change because of COVID. It's hard to predict at this point. We were looking at a back to normal kind of space utilization for the building.
Supplementary, if I may, is it a foregone conclusion then that when you looked at airflow, filter systems, proximity of staff, that we can anticipate that it would accommodate any unique needs that could occur vis-a-vis pandemic?
So the mechanical and electrical assessments were based on the age of the equipment that was there and sort of replacement like for like. Obviously, new equipment comes with better performance, better efficiency. So more from a sustainability perspective, it's a benefit, but also from a airflow and reliability perspective, these replacements would improve the conditions in the building. filters and UV and the various technologies that are being explored right now for controlling virus spread and that type of thing is not something we looked in any great detail in the assessment. It was more about replacing of end of life equipment that is observed in the building.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions?
No comment, Mr. Chair, other than to say thank you for the comprehensive reporting. And like Don, I really appreciated the staffing picture as it appears right now and projections going into the future. So thank you again for the presentations today.
Chris, I have one final question. Roof upgrade, roof repairs was one of the priorities on there. And maybe stepping ahead of time, would you leave that roof configuration where two slanted roofs drain onto a flat roof? Would you leave that, or would that be reconsidered at that time?
There are probably some better practice detailing that we would recommend for sure. In terms of the kind of raw numbers that we identified, it was basically area of roof that needs to be replaced like for like, but in terms of detailing that re-roofing package, there's probably some improvements that could be made for sure.
Okay, thank you. And John, I'm sure you've had conversation with the chief and his staff, but we'll give his staff got any questions in regards to the staffing report for John?
I've never used this before, so yeah, thank you both to John and Chris. It was a great experience working with both of them, actually. And, from an administrative standpoint, you hear a lot of anecdotal talk about how busy we are and about how we're lacking space here, there, and everywhere else. But Pat, I can conceptualize the comment you made in we have one toilet for all the men in the building in the men's change room. So that would be underutilized, I guess, or understaffed, or whatever you want to call it, or overutilized, maybe, I don't know. But certainly from a planning standpoint for us, we knew that to come to council and say we need X number of officers, the obvious question is show me why. And it's nice to be able to put some numbers and some statistics forward that really support our anecdotal belief that we did. So, from a planning standpoint, we thought it was imperative for us to have this information before we move forward. So, thank you.
So I think just a final comment. Thank you for your presentation. I hope your work leads to a long-term relationship with us. I'm glad today didn't come up with any technical glitches like we had last time, and really appreciate your work. So thank you, gentlemen. Hopefully we'll have a long-term relationship here as a result of your work.
Appreciate it. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Shall we go?
You are dismissed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent presentation. Nice to have them come through, and technology is pretty amazing, isn't it? Let's go to the open portion of the meeting. Minutes of the previous meeting from February the 18th were circulated with our package. Any comments, questions, motion to receive?
I so move. It's Wanda.
Thank you. Second? Salome?
Val?
Thank you. I guess we can go with all in favor again, as opposed, anybody opposed? All in favor? Show of hands. Thank you. Carried. Next is the statistical report for February. Anybody have any questions on that for Mark?
Just a comment, it's Wanda, Mr. Chair. Increase in the traffic tickets. I don't know whether we now have more time or to, issue traffic tickets, or or whether people are speeding more, or I was just wondering why that increase. Also, sick time and criminal, there just seems to be increase around that.
So I'll start with our increase in incidents, which again, for this time of year are trending a lot higher than normal. But as we mentioned last month, we're now recording property checks and focus patrol events, which are often occurring through the early morning hours. So 317 of those incident numbers are property check and focus patrol events. With regard to the high criminal numbers, again, we had 20 fail to attend charges, and then we had 3 files that each had a significant number of charges that accounts for that number. With regards to the traffic tickets, it's a combination of directed enforcement initiatives that we've brought into a more formalized type arrangement, but probably the bigger reason is that we've been able to dedicate additional staff, as we have some staff members returning from accommodated positions to frontline duties. We've been able to increase our traffic enforcement footprint during the daytime. So that's probably the biggest reason for that. And for sick time, I can speak to the specifics in close, but we have a couple of people dealing with some significant illness and injury issues that accounts for that.
Thank you. Any further questions?
Thank you for that.
Being no further questions, we'll call the question. All in favor? Thank you. Carried. Accounts for February 2021. I'm not sure whether the abbreviated version of the accounts this month also will reflect to your budget report later on here, but they seem to be fairly short today. Any questions? If not, I'll call a motion to receive the accounts for February. Andy, seconded by Pat. All in favor? Carried. Don't have anything under the consent agenda. Old business, item number 5. I have nothing to report from the zone or the OAPSB. What about our consultation committee? Our survey is up and running, and I presume the phone survey has started. I haven't heard anybody that's got a call yet. Can you give us an update?
Yes. Oh, go ahead, Val.
No, I invite you to start as well, Rhonda. Feel free to do that.
The survey is up and running, and I did go in and do a practice one. I didn't submit it, and I think that it was easy to access and it was easy to maneuver, and I'm really pleased with the product Forum has produced for us. I think probably Mark or Val could maybe speak to the number of people who have completed it thus far.
Thanks, Wanda. I reiterate the pleasure with which we've experienced working with Forum. They've certainly been responsive and I think invited a very collaborative development for the project. Yes, we've had quite a good response, I would suggest, after the excellent publicity that was received, with appreciation to Catherine Whitnall. I think it underscores a privilege that we have in small communities when we do have a good working relationship as well as interest from our local reporters. So grateful for that. We still need to probably increase response. So I think the chief was encouraged by Forum to maybe continue efforts to ensure that the public's aware that this survey is underway. I've been putting my thinking cap on as to how we can also augment response. I think one has to be careful always that you don't just augment response with those who are facile with technology. We need to try and figure out how we can ensure a broad spectrum of response from our local citizens. So, perhaps some thoughts in terms of ways by which we can ensure that we do have a good sampling number. And that's where we will put our efforts, and perhaps the police might want to speak to that as well in terms of any ancillary efforts that we think would be beneficial to undertake. So overall, I think the sequencing and timing is favorable. We should be able to bring reports in on time, and that's always nice to be able to say. So maybe the chief might want to round it out with his usual thorough overview.
I think you've pretty well covered everything. The only thing I would add is that the telephone survey is underway. We have had some feedback. We had one member who got a phone call a little after 9 p.m. and wasn't too happy about it. So we've refined the time of the calls with Forum, and hopefully won't have that issue. So that's underway as well. As Val mentioned, the take up on the online survey was very good the first couple days, and it's tapered off. So now we're going to re-hit through our social media channels, and just try to keep that interest level up.
I was also going to mention that we all likely have some contact on social media, and if we could share or retweet or get the word out there in any way just to promote that online survey on our website as board members, and try and get the word out as best we can. I'll have to ask just how long that survey is online for, and when do we expect to close that down? Valme or Wanda?
I think it's online until the 31st of March. That was my understanding. Whether it could be extended, Forum has really been receptive to any suggestions we have, and perhaps we can look at the number of contacts they've made through their phone survey, they being Forum, and also the number of online surveys that have been completed before we change that timeline by extending it.
Good thought, Wanda.
Okay, that sounds good, and of course, we've got the committee. You guys decide if you think we've got enough. I'm sure the figure's out there, but I think we had around 800 last time we did it, and thought that was fantastic. So we'll see where it goes. It's hard to get people interested. Anything further on that? Just a motion to receive the verbal report from our committee. Motion by Wanda?
Sure, Val?
Val, thank you. Second?
Seconded. Thank you.
All in favor? Carried. Item 6.1, Canadian Association of Police Governance, invoice for membership from them. I see new rates. Chris, I'd almost have to ask you, is that less than other years? However, it's for $1,000 for our membership. We've been a member of this organization for quite some time, and we get a national perspective, and I think it's a good thing to belong. So just before Chris answers on the amount, well, no, we'll get Chris. Amount-wise?
I'll have to look it up. I'm sorry, I didn't have that information ready for you, but it hasn't increased dramatically over the last several years. So I can check into it and send an email if you wish to people.
No, I'm sorry to kind of blindside you with that. I just thought $1,000 was cheaper than it has been. Perhaps I'm wrong. So let's have a motion to receive that and pay our 2021 account. Motion by Pat, second by Andy. All in favor? Carried. Thank you. Report of the chief. Item number 7.1, our budget actuals for 2020. Mark?
So you have the budget report in front of you. I would just draw your attention to a couple of lines, and although from a percentage wise, it's a small amount. If you look at the variance and you look at the police operations and the communications line, you'll see that's where the majority of our over budget expenses came in. Ultimately, we ended up in a deficit of around $40,000. Offsetting that was our lower than anticipated costs in court security, which you're aware of. We were able to achieve some savings there through attrition and staffing reductions. And our the other item that's a big change from last year is our Central East. For the first time in 2020, we did not recover those expenses, so we've captured that as one full-time equivalent officer, which is a generally rated expense because it is a provincial facility. So that is that is an expense that we haven't had in past years. And beyond that, you're aware of some WSIB billings that I can speak to further in closed.
Thank you. Any questions? Pat?
I think maybe Mark touched on it in one of the other meetings. Just the training is down. We're doing a lot of, obviously with the COVID-19, and we can do maybe online training as opposed to sending people away.
Yeah, we are looking at that. Some of the specialized courses aren't suitable to be done online, or they're a hybrid format where they do what they can online and then they have an in-class portion. As you may or may not be aware, the Ontario Police College is in the midst of a COVID outbreak right now. They've shut down the recruit class, which is the priority. There was very little in terms of senior officer training that occurred in 2020. There was a number of senior level courses that were anticipated and scheduled between the current intake class and the next intake class in May, and they've all been postponed. So we're anxiously looking at that, just like every other service in the province. We're starting to get a little bit behind on our training needs for some of those senior level courses. So it's an area we're watching really closely.
Thank you. Always wanted to do this, Mr. Mayor. Go ahead. Your question.
It doesn't work that well, so good luck. Yeah, just for Mark, so I'm just, interesting with the court security. I mean, obviously that wasn't a budgeted cost and we were able to absorb it for a few things. That's going to be harder to do as we move forward. And because it is a provincial facility, I'm wondering if we should be looking at, all the costs of policing that facility being more generally rated than just allocating one officer. Like you're saying, there's 1,000 calls a year, roughly, to that facility. So, I wonder if it's worth looking at a further breakdown of, what is it costing the Kawartha Lakes Police Service really overall to, offer policing service to that facility, and, should more of those costs be generally rated as opposed to strictly one officer? I just wondered if you have any feedback on that.
I do. As the board is well aware, this has been a struggle we've been having with the ministry and with the province throughout this year. It was, from an accounting perspective, it was at the start of the year we allocated one full-time resource. I completely concur that we should probably do a more accurate accounting of that. And as we went through 2020 and our plan to reassign a lot of the work that had previously been done by us back to the facility, met with resistance from the correction side. We had a choice to make to either just assume that liability and not do the work, or assign some additional resources to cover off that work and those responsibilities that corrections just would not take back on. So that's an excellent point, and we will make sure that we capture those totals more accurately.
Thank you. Just as a quick update on the facility out there, the Central North, we also, at Penetang, we wondered, they're policed by the OPP, and we wondered whether or not the OPP were paying there, and we've been following the newspaper articles there. Nobody told them that that funding was going to be cut down, and their Police Services Board and Council got a bill for 2020 and 2021 that they weren't expecting and weren't aware of. The rest of us had been on top of this for some time, although not being too successful in gaining anything back. But at least we were told about it, and apparently up there they weren't told about it. So fun to watch the Midland Penetang news. It's a pretty hot topic up there for $800,000 that they didn't expect. Could I have a motion to receive the report PSB 2021-004 budget actuals? Motion?
I so
Andy?
move. It's Wanda.
Wanda, moved by Wanda, seconded by Andy. All in favor? Carried. Just before we go into close, does anybody have any questions for the chief or his staff? Just hang on a second. Mark has a comment.
Just a few additional things to update you on. First, in regards to COVID, since our last meeting, we've only laid 3 additional charges under the Reopening Ontario Act. As you are likely aware, the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police and the Police Association of Ontario worked jointly together with the province to have police added to the Phase 1 vaccine distribution list. So that was successful, and we were able to have our frontline folks vaccinated through the RMH clinic. The vaccine clinic at the exhibition, the mass immunization clinic at the Lex opens today. The hospital and paramedic service and the health unit have done a great job in getting that set up and coordinated. So we will, it's not anticipated that we'll need to assist them, but we've offered if they need any assistance with traffic management or anything, that all they need to do is call us. Community Safety and Wellbeing Plan Committee met since the last meeting. We have a working session scheduled for the 31st of March. I have a staffing update. We've hired 3 part-time communicators who started their training at the start of March. And for the first time, we've started a new training program. Previously, communicators would just go right into the communication center with a training communicator and just learn on the go. For the first time, we've started them off in a classroom environment to make sure that we have consistent standards, bring them all up to the same level in a controlled environment, and then put them into an operational setting. So that's working out very well. Mrs. Heminger and one of our communicators, Jenny Fox, have done a lot of work in setting up that program. Have done a great job. Sticking with communications, you may have seen a media release, I think last week. We've launched a new location service called What 3 Words, and there's been already some successes in the Guelph and London area. So basically, in a nutshell, what that does is every 3 square meters in the world have been assigned 3 random words, and if somebody is lost but able to get even a weak cell phone signal, we can send them a link, and then we can find their What 3 Word location and basically pinpoint down where they are and direct emergency services to them. So I'm not sure if our media partners are on it, but if they have any interest in following up with that, I can connect them with the resources in our office. And following up from our last meeting, very pleased to report that Nolan Dunn was the successful candidate in our police recruit process. and soon-to-be cadet Dunn will be moving from court security to the uniform division in April, where he'll start his patrol training, and if OPC stays on schedule, he'll attend down there for his basic constable training in early May. That's it for me.
If anybody hasn't been on that 3 words, it's a pretty neat app to get. Hit the button and you'll find out that the mayor's chair here at City Hall is known as Chin's Training Turkey. Just for those if you happen to get lost. It really is a pretty neat app. You have a breakdown, your vehicle, you can give them that, they query it, they know exactly within 3 square feet, 3 square meters where you are. Yeah, it's pretty neat. Any questions on the chief's update on a number of things? Congratulations on the part-timers. Nice to hear there's a little difference in training there. That's good. Any other questions before we ask for a motion to move into closed? There being none, Pat? Motion to move into closed.